going on? They say the Russians just invaded West Germany.
This is nuclear war.
Greetings, Professor Falcon.
Welcome to a new series of nuclear nightmares. Kicking things off for our first episode, we have a counterfactual history docudrama made for German television in 1998. World War III. I love a movie title that gives away the ending, don't you? I'm sorry, it's just that a lot of these films which I have reviewed and shall review in this frankly unexpected third series are all very formulaic. Has anyone ever sat down in front of any of these movies and genuinely thought to themselves, gee, I wonder what happens? Our movie begins with a scene of frantic activity at the US Strategic Air Command headquarters. It would seem that somebody somewhere has a short temper. Well, when I say somebody I mean the Soviet Premier, and when I say somewhere I mean, of course, Russia. All this activity is followed by a news report in front of the White House delivered by a guy who seems a bit too relaxed about the whole affair.
White House. The sirens have just gone off all over Washington, as you can probably hear. There is every indication that something has gone terribly wrong.
My superpower is that I state the obvious.
There is a tremendous amount of activity going on at the White House, but I'm unable to convey to you any of what's going on. Nobody...
That's one way to end an unstructured editorial piece, I suppose. Now that jolly little intro has set us up for the rest of the film, where we learn about the unraveling international crisis which has led to our ultimate demise. We start in West Berlin, 1989. Across Eastern Europe, a wave of anti-communist sentiment has grown, and the republic which surrounds the Western enclave is no exception. The unrest, apparently, has been stirred up by Mikhail Gorbachev and his liberal reforms. This has led many in Warsaw Pact countries to look upon their respective regimes unfavorably. In East Germany, Erich Honecker orders the Stasi to break up demonstrations. This prompts many East Germans to make for the West German embassy and the inner German border to effect an escape. Thousands get away. As the anniversary of the formation of the East German Communist state looms, Gorbachev prepares for a visit. Communist hardliners are hoping he will announce at least a relaxation of his planned reforms. Liberals are hoping he will go further. Someone is going to be disappointed. Initially it is the hardline communists, but ultimately, anyone who has grown fond of oxygen is going to be a tad pissed off.
Я думаю, опасности только подстерегают тех, кто не реагирует на жизнь.
Ich glaube, Gefahren warten nur auf jene, die nicht auf das Leben reagieren.
А тот, кто воспринимает импульсы жизни, общества и трансформирует их в соответствующую политику,
aufgreift und dementsprechend seine Politik gestaltet,
того трудности не должны пугать. Это нормально.
Der dürfte keine Angst vor Schwierigkeiten haben. Das ist eine normale Erscheinung.
Спасибо, до свидания.
Dankeschön. Wiedersehen.
Gorbachev leaves after his speech, never to be seen again.
This is Radio Moscow. Following his return from celebrations in East Berlin, General handed over leadership to Comrade General Vladimir Soshkin.
Mr. President, you know who is actually in? What do you believe the motivation is, sir, behind the coup? Why did they remove him?
We don't know that. We don't know that. Clearly, some of the hardliners have been concerned about the rapidity of reform. They've been concerned about the demise of the Communist Party per se, and I think they've also been concerned about the Soviet economy. But I've said over and over again that we did not want to see a coup backed by the KGB and the military, and apparently that is what is underway.
There have been violent street battles in Moscow throughout the night. Opponents of the coup have fought back bravely with rocks and Molotov cocktails. They are no match, however, against the heavily armed forces of the Soviet Interior Ministry, the so-called Black Berets. It is unknown how many people have been killed or wounded, but local hospitals are reporting hundreds of casualties.
By dawn, the Soviet army has seized control of the city. All opposition is driven underground. The fate of the Soviet Empire is now in the hands of one man, General Vladimir Ilyanovich Soshkin.
And what a dear little chap he looks. We are given a brief but terrifying window into Soshkin's past. The news is not exactly music to Western ears.
Well, the word that we had been getting from the CIA about General Soshkin was disturbing, to say the very least. He represented what we call the old guard. Now, you see, these were guys who had been spending their whole life in building up the Soviet state. So they were in no mood for Big Macs and MTV, let alone an opening in the Iron Curtain. So then, these are the facts about General Soshkin as we knew them at the time and as I reported to the President in my briefing. Legend has it that he was among the group of soldiers that raised the Soviet flag over the Reichstag in Berlin at the end of the Second World War. Well, at least that's the story he liked to tell. At any rate, we do know that he stayed on with the Soviet occupation forces there. And he probably was involved in a very brutal crackdown of a workers' uprising in 1953. There are a lot of good people who had gone down in that. As far as we know, he never married, but there's very little known about his personal life. Now, Soshkin received a certain degree of notoriety in 1968. He led a particularly ruthless armed battalion onto the streets of Prague to suppress the so-called Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia. Now, by this time, this type of work has sort of become his specialty, you might say. At any rate, he got his picture right on the front of Life magazine. Well, as you can see, it's not a very flattering portrait. Sometime around, 1982, he was appointed to the Politburo and assigned to the Interior Ministry, where he seemed to have absorbed a lot of nutty ideas that were circulating around there, including one enormous bit of crap that there was some master plan that was being engineered by the British and the Americans to destroy the USSR. I mean, Jesus. My impression was, here is a guy with his finger right there on the nuclear button who was, well, shall we say, not exactly playing with a full deck. Well, the president was sitting there and just growing a little bit more agitated and more agitated as I was giving him his briefing. Well, I suppose nobody likes to hear bad news.
One of the first things the world's newest nutcase does is call a meeting of the Supreme Soviet to discuss how to deal with the rising tide of anti-communism in the Warsaw Pact states. It is brought to the ass-head-in-chief's attention that the Chinese had dealt with the problem in Tiananmen Square in a similar way that Brezhnev had dealt with the Prague Spring. We have a winner. As you can imagine, this causes a wave of violence throughout the whole of East Germany. The Stasi are unable to deal with it all, and so Honecker, the great guy that he was, orders units of the East German army onto the streets. It doesn't end well.
In East Germany, thousands of so-called subversives are rounded up and jailed. Others simply disappear. Among them, several of the more moderate members of the top leadership. Egon Krenz, once thought to be the most likely successor to Erich Honecker, is said to be in Moscow undergoing surgery. Hans Modrau, the local party chief of Dresden, is appointed ambassador to Mongolia. And Politburo member Gunter Schabowski, who openly expressed sympathy for Gorbachev, is, according to rumors, tried for treason and shot.
International opinion is rightly critical of Shoshkin and his overbearing tactics, so much so that the NATO alliance beefs up its armed forces along the inner German border. Outraged East Berliners try to scale the wall in an effort to escape. The East German army ends up firing shots into West Germany. Of course, the Russians for their part have a good explanation for their actions.
Если соседский дом загорелся, то наш долг помочь потушить его. Если мы этого не сделаем, то пожар может распространиться и перекинуться на наш собственный дом. В этом нет ничего подозрительного. Элементарная логика. В определенный момент надо прекращать всякие разговоры и принимать меры.
I hope those thoughts keep you warm in the middle of a nuclear winter. Fearing that the unrest in East Germany and the rest of Eastern Europe is the work of Western conspirators, the Russians cut off the road links to West Berlin and the people on the wrong side of the Berlin Wall begin to starve, fearing that he will soon lose control of the situation. The Russian army chief for this sector agrees to meet with the Americans to negotiate, and is promptly blown up by a neo-Nazi group.
Wir fordern ein Ende der 40-jährigen sowjetischen Besatzung. Unser Kampf gilt der Einheit unseres Vaterlandes. Am 14. Dezember 1989 haben wir den Kommandeur der russischen Streitkräfte angegriffen. Wir werden weitere Aktionen durchführen, bis unsere Forderungen erfüllt sind. Wir sind ein Volk. Heil! Heil! Heil!
The Russians really don't want a repeat of the Berlin airlift, so, just to make life easier for everyone, they set up an air exclusion zone around East Germany, threatening to shoot down any aircraft which violates. This leads to yet more posturing and saber-rattling from the West.
Are you going to leave these children, these women, these defenseless people to a murderous dictator to have more scenes like that, and the West do nothing effective? Is that our policy? It's not worthy of Europe, it's not worthy of the West, it's not worthy of the United States. Perhaps these pictures will bring people to the realization they can be more effective.
The Russians are by now convinced that the British and the Americans are about to launch a military offensive to relieve the city of West Berlin. So they come up with an ambitious plan.
Союз был вынужден принять следующие меры по обеспечению мира и безопасности в Европе. В данный момент наш флот в Северной Атлантике подготавливает зону запрета, показанную вот на этой карте. За пределами этой зоны мы будем действовать в интересах нашей национальной безопасности. Любая попытка игнорировать эту меру будет расценена как враждебный акт, и наши вооруженные силы примут соответствующие контрмеры. Я хочу добавить, что советское руководство твердо занимает следующую позицию. Все конфликты в Центральной Европе должны решаться за столом переговоров, а не на поле брани.
Ambitious to say the least, but we'll get to that a bit later on. Naturally, the Western Alliance will not tolerate this outrage, and assemble a vast armada of military convoys and naval escort battle groups. On entering the exclusion zone, the two vast navies engage in a battle for control of the Atlantic. NATO wins, but the bad news is that a state of war now exists between the United States and her allies, and the Soviet Union. The Russians don't wait for the West to make the next move.
The attack begins where it is least expected. A daylight naval assault along the Baltic coast of West Germany, backed up by heavy Soviet bombing. Within hours, 12,000 men of the Soviet Baltic Fleet and the East German Navy stormed the beaches. Heavy equipment is moved ashore. Meeting little resistance, they gradually make their way inland. NATO throws much of its available forces north to hold the line. West German, British and Dutch units move in and are the first to engage the enemy advance. Backing them up is the newly arrived 40,000-man 3rd US Corps, moving up rapidly from ports along the North Sea.
The feint attack on the northwest German coast is highly effective, causing the real offensive across the inner German border and the Czech border to proceed with some ease. Well, as much ease as you'd probably expect. Civilians living in Wiesbaden might take a slightly different view. A week into the offensive and it would appear that the Russians might get as far as the Rhine, forcing the West to the negotiating table, assuming that we don't simply fry the Russians instead. Time is running out before the NATO forces have little choice but to explode tactical nuclear weapons over the advancing Russians. But a daring air raid on Warsaw Pact communications centers behind enemy lines throws the advance into chaos, causing Western forces to push the Russians back. Technically outmatched and with poor communications, the Russians end up yielding control of West Berlin to the Allies. This is where it starts to get a bit dodgy. General Shoskin is pretty convinced that the Allies will push on perhaps across Eastern Europe and into the Soviet Union itself. To warn the Allies off, he orders the detonation of a nuclear device over the North Sea. It is at this point that the Soviet people begin to rise up against their own government. Just in case this isn't bad enough, Soviet computers go on the blink and tell their missile commanders that the US has launched a massive nuclear strike on them. You'll never guess what happens next. No, really.
The Soviet strategic rocket forces are given orders to launch. There is no further historical record of what happens next.
Before we look at the finer points of this film and talk about its authenticity in the real world of the Cold War, I'd like to introduce a new section for this series, which will be added whenever copyright usage permits. My favorite bit. My favorite bit has to be the overly calm news correspondent. He makes another appearance toward the end of the movie.
This is Daniel Shore at the Pentagon. Sources in the Defense Department are telling me that at this very moment, active preparations are in progress for initiating what is known around here as the SIOP, that is the Single Integrated Operation Plan. That is the secret war plan for launching up to 12,000 nuclear attacks on targets in the Soviet Union.
So, the nuclear attack plan has been initiated, and he's discussing it the same way a reporter might cover a short piece about a congressman forgetting which district he represents. I wonder how another news channel might have covered it.
ABCDEFG News with Dan to Dan.
First City News. Moscow is no longer a city. In other news, we're all fucked. Good night.
Before people get too hot about this, I am not trying to belittle CBS anchor Daniel Ska, or his contribution to journalism. He agreed to appear in this production as himself. Made for German television in 1998, World War III cleverly combines real-life archive news footage and set pieces involving actors to give the whole production an authentic feel. The footage involving German Chancellor Helmut Kohl come from interviews around the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall. The footage of George Bush Sr. is taken from the August coup against Gorbachev in August 1991. As well as the build-up to the First Gulf War. It is from that event that we get the footage of Mrs. Thatcher, and later in the film we see her answering questions in the House of Commons based on Britain's response to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. In 1996, acclaimed documentary director Robert Stone was approached by the German television company ZDF to make a series of films about the development of the atom bomb. The film's producer was concerned that they would simply be retreading old ground covered in previous films. It was Stone who came up with the idea of making a prologue to global thermonuclear war. With the addition of the stock footage including film of NATO exercises and weapons tests, a plausible narrative was constructed, and this interesting and thought-provoking movie is the result. So, could this actually have happened? In my opinion, and to be certain that's all I've got, it depends which bit. The coup of August 1991 might have succeeded, if the conspirators had managed to capture Boris Yeltsin. As for the naval exclusion zone, I suspect that there would have been serious logistical problems with it. On a tactical level it would have meant that when crunch time came, the Soviet vessels may have found themselves caught between the US Navy on one side and vessels of the British, Norwegian, West German and French navies on the other. When the inevitable clash of arms takes place, I don't doubt that the Soviets, under the conditions I have just described, would have come off worse. However, it's amazing to see the level of restraint on both sides in such a naval engagement, because lest we forget,
our main battery in both the United States Navy and the Soviet Navy at sea are nuclear weapons. And if you have Soviet submarines, as apparently is happening, converging with our aircraft carriers, it's just a question of which side uses nuclear weapons first. I know that from my own experience that I would not hesitate 1 minute to use nuclear weapons when confronted with Soviet submarines.
There might not have been a ground offensive at all. This is all speculation, of course, but it brings me to the point of this film, which for me is gratitude. From the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan until the collapse of the Soviet Union, many people thought that the Cold War could only end one way. Everyone was of the opinion that nuclear war was coming, it was simply a question of when. But history took a different course, something for which we can all be grateful, but as this film shows, it could have been very different. That's all for this episode. Join us next time on Nuclear Nightmares, but until then remember.
Как говорят у нас в России, держать друзей близко, нас сохранит ваш враги в наручниках батареи или обогревателей.